Marxist-Leninist atheism, also known as Marxist-Leninist scientific atheism, is a part of the wider Marxist-Leninist philosophy, which was irreligious and anti-clerical, while at the same time advocating a materialist understanding of nature. Marxism-Leninism holds that religion is the opium of the people, in the sense of promoting passive acceptance of suffering on earth in the hope of eternal reward. Therefore, Marxism-Leninism advocates the abolition of religion and the acceptance of atheism. In addition, Marxist-Leninist scientific atheism purports to explain the origin of religion, as well as what it teaches to be scientific criticism of it. Marxist-Leninist atheism has its roots in the philosophy of Ludwig Feuerbach, W. F. Hegel, Karl Marx, and Vladimir Lenin. Some non-Soviet Marxists opposed this anti-religious stance, and in certain forms of Marxist thinking, such as the liberation theology movements in Latin America among others, Marxist-Leninist atheism was rejected entirely. Influence of Feuerbach and left Hegelians. Marx, from the earliest times in his career, had been heavily involved in debates surrounding the philosophy of religion in early 19th century Germany. Bitter controversies surrounding the proper interpretation of the Hegelian philosophical legacy greatly formed Marx's thinking about religion. The Hegelians considered philosophy as an enterprise meant to serve the insights of religious comprehension, and Hegel had rationalized the fundamentals of the Christian faith in his elaborate philosophy of spirit. Hegel, while being critical of contemporary dogmatic religion, retained an intellectual interest in the ontological and epistemological beliefs of Christianity. His philosophy was compatible with theological views, and religious explanations of the deepest questions of being were considered unquestionably valuable by him, but needing additional clarification, systematization and argumentative justification. His philosophy worked as a conceptual enterprise based upon the truths of his faith. His legacy was debated after his death in 1831 between the young Hegelians and materialist atheists, including especially the German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach. Marx sided with the materialist atheists in his rejection of all forms of religious philosophy, including the most liberal forms of such, and Feuerbach greatly influenced him. Feuerbach wanted to separate philosophy from religion and to give philosophers intellectual autonomy from religion in their interpretation of reality. Feuerbach objected to Hegel's philosophical notions that he believed were based on his religious views. Feuerbach attacked the conceptual foundations of theology and wanted to undermine religion by introducing a new religion of humanity by redirecting fundamental human concerns of dignity, the meaning of life, morality and purpose of existence within an invented atheistic religion that did not hold belief in anything supernatural, but which would serve as an answer to these concerns. Feuerbach considered that the antithesis of human and divine was based on an antithesis between human nature generally and individual humans, and came to the conclusion that humanity as a species possessed within itself all the attributes that merited worship and that people had created God as a reflection of these attributes. He wrote, but the idea of deity coincides with the idea of humanity. All divine attributes, all the attributes which make God God, are attributes of the species, attributes which in the individual are limited, but the limits of which are abolished in the essence of the species, and even in its existence, insofar as it has its complete existence only in all men taken together. Feuerbach wanted to destroy all religious commitments and to encourage an intensive hatred towards the old God. All religious institutions needed to be eradicated from the earth and from the memory of coming generations, so that they would never again find power over people's minds through the deception and promotion of fear from the mystical forces of God. It was this thinking that the young Karl Marx was deeply attracted by, and Marx adopted much of Feuerbach's thought into his own philosophical worldview. Marx considered that the higher goals of humanity would justify any radicalism, both intellectual as well as social, political radicalism, in order to achieve its ends. Marx, in his rejection of all religious thought, Marx considered the contributions of religion over the centuries to be unimportant and irrelevant to the future of humanity. The autonomy of humanity from the realm of supernatural forces was considered by Marx as an axiomatic ontological truth that had been developed since ancient times, and he considered it to have an even more respectable tradition than Christianity. He argued that religious belief had been invented as a reaction against the suffering and injustice of the world. In Marx's view, the poor and oppressed were the original creators of religion, and they used it as a way to reassure themselves that they would have a better life in the future after death. Thus, it served as a kind of opium, or a way to escape the harsh realities of the world. Religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sign of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Furthermore, in his view, atheistic philosophy had liberated human beings from suppressing the natural potential and allowed for people to realize that they, rather than any supernatural force that required obedience, were the masters of reality. Marx's opposition to religion was based especially upon this view, in that he believed religion alienated humans from reality and held them back from their true potential. He therefore considered that religion needed to be removed from society. The decomposition of man into Jew and citizen, Protestant and citizen, religious man and citizen, is neither a deception directed against citizenhood, nor is it a circumvention of political emancipation. It is political emancipation itself, the political method of emancipating oneself from religion. Of course, in periods when the political state as such is born violently out of civil society, when political liberation is the form in which men strive to achieve their liberation, the state can and must go as far as the abolition of religion, the destruction of religion, but it can do so only in the same way that it proceeds to the abolition of private property, to the maximum, to confiscation, to progressive taxation, just as it goes as far as the abolition of life, the guillotine. At times of special self-confidence, political life seeks to suppress its prerequisite, civil society and the elements composing this society, and to constitute itself as the real species life of man, devoid of contradictions. But it can achieve this only by coming into violent contradiction with its own conditions of life, only by declaring the revolution to be permanent. And, therefore, the political drama necessarily ends with the re-establishment of religion, private property, and all elements of civil society, just as war ends with peace. Marx came to see that religion was determined by the economic superstructure, and therefore he believed abolishing class society would lead to an end to religion. He wrote much about these things before he had much developed his ideas concerning the abolition of private property and communism. Hostility towards religion was in fact the beginning of Marx's philosophical career, and it preceded dialectic materialism. It became critically fused with his economic and social ideas in his claim that religion, along with all other forms of thought, was the product of material conditions and a distribution of property. When the economic structures that created religion were destroyed, religion assumedly would disappear with it. He therefore believed that religion needed to be combated through pragmatic approach of attacking the economic base of religion and to attack the causes of religion. He considered that religion was an opiate that people needed in order to support themselves in harsh conditions of life, and he furthermore held the view that these harsh conditions were kept in place with the support of religion. In order to eliminate religion, he therefore held that he needed to eliminate the harsh conditions that caused people to hold illusory superstitions that comforted them, and in order to eliminate these conditions he concluded that religion, since it supported the existence of such conditions, therefore needed to be eliminated. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for the real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about the condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. The criticism of religion is therefore, in embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. In this way he transformed Feuerbach's attack on religion from a mainly philosophical critique into a call for physical action. He therefore held that atheism was the philosophical foundation stone of his ideology, but in itself was insufficient. Communism begins from the outset with atheism, but atheism is at first far from being communism. Indeed, that atheism is still mostly an abstraction. The intellectual atheism held by Feuerbach and others of his time was transformed by Marx into a more sophisticated consideration and critique of material conditions responsible for religion. Feuerbach starts out from the fact of religious self-alienation, of the duplication of the world into a religious world and a secular one. His work consists in resolving the religious world into its secular basis, but that the secular basis detaches itself from itself and establishes itself as an independent realm in the clouds can only be explained by the cleavages and self-contradictions within this secular basis. The latter must therefore, in itself, be both understood in its contradiction and revolutionized in practice. Thus, for instance, after the earthly family is discovered to be the secret of the Holy Family, the former must then itself be destroyed in theory and in practice. Feuerbach, consequently, does not see that the religious sentiment is itself a social product, and that the abstract individual whom he analyses belongs to a particular form of society. Dialectical materialism had the task of offering itself as an alternative to religious views of creation. Human beings were the natural products of the interplay of material forces, and there was no room for supernatural interference in human destiny. Religion had originally come about, according to Marx, as a kind of escape of the exploited classes from the harsh realities of existence and an illusion that comforted one in the hope of a future reward. Although this was its origin with the oppressed classes, the ruling classes had taken control of religion and used it as a tool of emotional and intellectual control of the masses. Marx considered Christianity to have been like this in its origin, as a religion for slaves hoping for a reward after the harsh existence, but in later becoming a kind of deceptive ideology that the ruling classes used to maintain the status quo. It is self-evident, moreover, that spectres, bonds, the higher being, concept, scruple, are merely the idealistic, spiritual expression, the conception apparently of the isolated individual, the image of very empirical fetters and limitations, within which the mode of production of life and the form of intercourse coupled with it move. The Christian religion had begun as spiritual protests against the conditions of life, wherein lower class classes believed that they were supernaturally favored over the richer ruling classes. However, it had deteriorated from its original goals into a kind of false consolation for people who accepted the subjection. This degeneration was viewed negatively in the later Marxist-Leninist tradition, as a kind of perversion of the original noble goals of religion by the social and cultural elite. This view that Christianity had been perverted by the elite partly justified revolutionary action in order to abolish it and replace it with atheism. The young Marx also adopted the views of Georg Friedrich Dahmer that Christians offered human sacrifices and consumed human blood and flesh. He believed that knowledge of these practices had dealt a death blow to Christianity. Marx's hostility towards religion lessened in his later career when he wrote less about the subject and showed less enthusiasm about combating religious belief. He came to consider later in his life that religion would disappear naturally through the richness of ideas that would emerge from a rationalized order of communistic social life. This idea, however, would later be attacked by Lenin and the succeeding Soviet establishment, even to the point of violence and purges directed at proponents of this rightist or mechanicist idea of religion disappearing on its own. In his later life he wrote only about a need to separate religion from the state, but he was still hostile to religious belief. He believed that belief in the existence of God was immoral and anti-human. The atheistic element of communism would be intensified in some Marxist movements after his death. Friedrich Engels wrote independently of Marx on contemporary issues, including religious controversies. In his works Anti-Clerical and Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Ideology, he engaged in criticism on the idealistic worldview in general, including religious outlooks on reality. He considered that religion was a fantastic reflection in the mind of the powers which caused miserable conditions in earlier stages of history. He believed that increasing humanity's control over its existence would eliminate these fantasies that were produced as a result of humanity's desperation with the world it lived in. Since belief in God came about as a result of a need in people for there to be some control over their existence, he therefore reasoned that by eliminating this need, religion would gradually disappear. And when this act has been accomplished, when society, by taking possession of all means of production and using them on a planned basis, has freed itself and all its members from the bondage in which they are now held by these means of production which they themselves have produced, but which confront them as an irresistible alien force. When therefore man no longer merely proposes, but also disposes, only then will the last alien force which is still reflected in religion vanish, and with it will also vanish the religious reflection itself, for the simple reason that then there will be nothing left to reflect. Engels considered religion as a false consciousness, and incompatible with communism. Engels, in his lifelong contacts with leaders of social democratic and communist parties in Europe as well as the founders of the First International, urged them to disseminate and cultivate atheism. He also called for scientific education on a massive scale in order to overcome the fears and illusions of people who required a religious explanation for the world around them. He believed that science would provide an explanation for things that people had formerly required religious concepts to fulfill, and by providing this explanation, people would no longer feel a need to have religion for this purpose. He wrote much about contemporary great scientific discoveries and used them to support the principles of dialectical materialism in all his popular works intended for the ordinary masses in the communist movements. These included discoveries in biology, physics, chemistry, anthropology and psychology. all of which Engels used to argue against a need for religious explanations of the world. He believed that science would make humanity confident of its own self and to embrace its proper lordship over reality. It would give humanity the ability to control the world he lived in and therefore to overcome the harsh conditions that produced the need in people to believe in a God who controlled the universe. In his view, scientific advancement in his time was justifying the materialist and atheistic outlook on the world that dialectical materialism held. Speculative philosophy and rational theology became obsolete in light of scientific advancement. The real unity of the world consists in its materiality, and this is proved not by a few juggled phrases, but by a long and wearisome development of philosophy and natural science. He also believed that scientific advancement required atheistic materialism to be changed as well and to become scientific rather than being a philosophy apart from the sciences. This modern materialism, the negation of the negation, is not the mere re-establishment of the old, but adds to the permanent foundations of this old materialism the whole thought content of 2,000 years of development of philosophy and natural science, as well as of the history of these 2,000 years. It is no longer a philosophy at all, but simply a world outlook which has to establish its validity and be applied not in a science of sciences standing apart, but in the real sciences. Philosophy is therefore sublated here, that is, both overcome and preserved. D. KG 503. Overcome as regards its form, and preserved as regards its real content. Engels' views on the need for scientific education and the need for materialistic atheism to rely on science spread widely among communists, and it would later become a fundamental position of Soviet education, which was hostile to religious belief.